Before I start this video, try to put on some headphones and really get into the mood for the story I'm about to tell you, because it's seriously one of the most intense things ever. This story happened back in 2016. There was this guy working on Wall Street, his name was Matt, and he was 25 years old. He lived near a mountain called Rainier in Washington state. His job was super tough, with a lot of pressure most of the time, and he didn't get much vacation either. Anyway, this is Matt. Whenever he got a few days off, he'd decide to just disappear into the woods and unwind. He just wanted to escape the noise of the city, even though Matt was already living alone in one of the biggest and busiest cities in the world. But the thing is, Matt was really experienced with outdoor trips like this, so he decided to start his trip and camp out in a beautiful spot surrounded by trees. He actually found this perfect place, set up his tent, started a fire, cooked his meal, and ate. Once he was done, he went into his tent and fell asleep. Now, to set the scene, Matt's deep in the forest, it's dark, he's camping alone, and there's no one around. So, while Matt's asleep, just a few minutes later, he wakes up to these weird noises coming from outside his tent. It sounded like some animals, or maybe just one animal, moving around a lot. The noise kept going for a bit. Matt turned over, unzipped the tent a little, just enough to peek through and see what kind of animal was bothering him. But what he saw was a shock. It wasn't an animal. It was a man, just sitting by the dead fire pit, stomping on the ashes with his feet and staring into the pit. He was just standing there, looking down, stomping on the coals. From time to time, he'd lift one foot and step down again, crushing the ashes. Now, Matt's still inside the tent, totally confused about what's going on and what this guy wanted. He just kept watching him through that small tent opening. Suddenly, the man looked up and locked eyes with Matt. As soon as their eyes met, the man's eyes went wide, like he was in shock. The man immediately stood up and ran away from Matt's campsite. Matt had no clue what had just happened or how to make sense of this weird situation. He quickly grabbed his flashlight, stepped out of the tent, and started looking around for the guy, wondering to himself, who was this person? I'm in the middle of the woods, no one's around, I'm completely isolated. Who could this be? How long had he been out there? And what did he even want? While Matt was trying to figure out who this guy was, he started walking around, searching for another camp, a fire, or any source of light or noise that might give a clue about this strange person. Maybe his campsite was nearby, and he had just wandered over to Matt's camp. And why had he come to his camp in the first place? So, Matt kept walking, looking around, even weaving between the trees, but there was no sign of anyone. Eventually, he headed back to his tent. He went inside, still baffled by who this guy was and why he'd been sitting outside his tent like that. And then, without any reason, the guy just disappeared into the forest, and he didn't even have a flashlight to light his way. It was pitch black, the darkest thing ever. After a night full of thinking and questions, the sun finally rose. Matt stepped out of his tent, convincing himself that what happened was no big deal. He thought, it's probably just someone camping nearby, that's all. Even though that was pretty rare since Matt had gone deep into the woods, where it was almost completely isolated from anyone. But he kept telling himself, that's all it was. Nothing serious happened. It's no big deal. Matt felt like there was nothing to worry about. No need to feel anxious. Matt packed up his campsite and continued walking through the forest, with no specific plan in mind, just wandering randomly. All he had was a map and a compass, and he was exploring the area. Over the next 2 days, he covered around 15 to 25 kilometers in different directions. Finally, he found a nice spot he liked and decided to camp there for the night. He lit a fire and sat by it, eating his meal. While eating, he heard some movement around him, and he was pretty sure it was an animal, so he looked around. When he didn't see anything, he went back to his food. A short while later, he heard another noise coming from behind him. This time, he couldn't ignore it because it was clear, there was something behind him, close, and moving. He stood up, scanning the area and focusing on the sound. He waited, thinking maybe a deer or rabbit would pop out and run away. But what happened next was totally unexpected. In the middle of the darkness, a voice came out, asking him, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" At that moment, Matt's heart started racing. Even though he hadn't seen the man, he immediately felt it was the same guy he'd seen 2 days ago. They were deep in the wilderness, in a completely isolated area, and he hadn't seen a single other person hiking or exploring like him. It was clear that this guy had been following Matt. Matt thought to himself, over the past 2 days, I've been walking randomly, the path has been winding, and I've covered around 25 kilometers. This guy must have followed me all that way. Matt was confused, thinking, how did he even keep up with me? Without thinking too much, he responded to the man's question, I don't know where Bell's Canyon is. Suddenly, everything went quiet. No sounds at all. Matt thought to himself, I hope this guy just leaves. I hope he doesn't come closer to the firelight. Then his thoughts shifted, no, actually, it'd be better if he did come closer. Maybe he's just another lost person looking for Bell's Canyon, and if he comes closer, we can talk normally, and everything will be fine. But what Matt was hoping for didn't happen. Suddenly, the man asked again, loudly and forcefully, do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon? This time, Matt didn't answer. All he felt was pure fear and terror. This clearly wasn't someone out for a hike or just looking for directions. Something was very wrong here. But Matt knew he couldn't show weakness or fear, so he steeled himself, grabbed his flashlight, took a deep breath, and quickly shone the light in the man's direction. The shock hit him, it was the same man he had seen sitting outside his tent 2 days ago. As soon as the light hit the man's face, he screamed at Matt, yelling for him to turn off the light. Matt instinctively lowered the flashlight from the man's face. Now, Matt was terrified, knowing that it was the same guy he'd been afraid of. The man just stood there, silent, not moving. But then, suddenly, he started slowly walking toward Matt, asking him again, do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon? His voice was now so close to Matt that it sent a wave of panic through him. The fear was overwhelming, and Matt couldn't hold it in anymore. He raised the flashlight again, shining it in the man's face. The man was only a few meters away, and this time, when the light hit him, his eyes widened in shock, just like before, and he bolted into the forest. Without thinking, Matt started running after him. But he only ran for about 30 seconds before realizing that the terrain was too dangerous and difficult. If he kept running, he'd probably fall, get injured, and end up stuck in the forest forever. The strange man was gone, far away now. So Matt returned to his tent, wondering, what do I do now? I have no cell service, I'm at least 3 days away from my car, and I'm deep in the forest. No one knows where I am, and I didn't even tell anyone I'd be camping out here. Matt was completely alone. At this moment, Matt grabbed his knife and stood in the middle of his campsite for hours and hours, looking around, expecting the man to show up at any moment and speak to him from the darkness. It was incredibly terrifying and nerve-wracking. By 3 a.m., Matt was completely exhausted. He told himself, I've been watching for hours, and the man hasn't appeared. It's probably best if I get a little sleep because tomorrow I'll need to pack up early and have a long hike back to my car. So, he went into his tent and quickly fell asleep from sheer exhaustion. After a few hours of anxious, restless sleep, the sun rose, and he got out of his tent as fast as he could. He packed up his gear and literally started running toward his car all day long. Every few moments, he'd look around, expecting to see the man following him. The man had tracked him for 25 kilometers over the past 2 days, so there was no guarantee he wasn't still out there. This kept Matt on edge and feeling like he was being watched. As time passed and the sun began to set, Matt realized he needed to find a spot to camp again, so he found a suitable location and set up his tent. He was completely exhausted from running the whole day, but it wasn't just physical tiredness, he was mentally drained from constantly thinking about the man. He entered his tent and fell asleep quickly. A few hours later, he woke up to the sound of someone moving around outside. He immediately knew it had to be the same man. He was still deep in the forest, far from his car, and was terrified. He stayed inside his tent, gripping his knife for hours and hours throughout the night, listening to the man moving around outside the tent. By 4 o'clock or 5 a.m., just as the sun began to rise, Matt rushed out, packed up his gear, and ran as fast as he could toward his car, hoping to reach it before he had to camp for another night. Matt kept running and moving all day, fully aware the man was still following him. There was no longer any doubt. But what stressed him the most was that he couldn't figure out where the man was. Unfortunately, time passed, and Matt realized he'd have to camp yet again since his car was still too far away. So, he found another place to set up his tent, and just like the previous night, he grabbed his knife and sat inside for hours, waiting to hear the man moving around again. But a long time passed, and nothing happened. Matt began to wonder, maybe he finally gave up and stopped following me. He let his guard down a bit, trying to relax and get some sleep. Slowly, his eyelids grew heavy, and his eyes started to close as the world around him fell silent. Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon? Matt's eyes flew open in shock, and his heart started pounding so hard he thought he might have a heart attack. He didn't know what to do, what to say, or how to react. He just sat there, gripping his knife, trembling in fear. Then the man started behaving strangely, making animal-like noises. He would stop for a moment and then repeat the same thing again. At times, he crawled through the leaves, then ran wildly around the tent over and over. Matt, inside the tent, was paralyzed with terror. Finally, the sun rose, and the man dashed off into the forest. At that moment, Matt quickly packed his gear and started running with all his might to reach his car. This time, he finally made it. He flung open the door, jumped inside, locked it, and the first thing he did was cry with relief. He felt a sense of comfort he never imagined. He sped out of the parking area, heading straight for a nearby hotel. As soon as he got phone reception, he thought about calling the police to tell them about the man, but then he asked himself, what am I going to tell them? The guy didn't commit any crime, it was just terrifying. So, he decided not to call the police. He got back in his car and finally returned to the city, still trying to process what had happened. He was chased by a stranger for 3 days, covering a distance of 50 kilometers across rugged and difficult terrain. All he kept asking was, do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon? That's where the story ends. Alright, see you next time. For those who haven't hit the like button yet, make sure you do. And if you haven't subscribed, my friend, hit that subscribe button.